Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Courtney, and I'm a Student Services Manager at North Central Texas College. This evening, we have a special guest, Amber, who has courageously agreed to share her survivor story of domestic violence with us with the hope of raising awareness. As you may imagine, sharing her personal story can be quite difficult, so Amber chose to write out her story and will mainly be reading it to us. The words you hear are her own, and the story is her own personal experience of domestic violence. As you hear Amber's story, if you have any questions for her, please feel free to put them in the chat. Amber?
Hello. Okay, guys. My name is Amber Clymer, and I'm a survivor of domestic violence. I'm going to start out today by reading you a compilation of something I put together for another survivor presentation and regarding a little bit about my life and my experience with domestic violence and sexual abuse. I want to start out by saying that healing doesn't look the same for everybody, and that's okay. What it took for me to get to where I am today and find some healing from the things that have happened in my life will probably look completely different than the next survivor. Today, I'm walking in newness of life thanks to a loving God who set his eyes upon me and did not stop pursuing my heart. I'm a mother to a blue-eyed little boy who thinks the world of me and whom I never thought I would see again. Today, I'm clean and sober going on 5 years and share the solution with anyone who's looking for a way out. I'm a hard worker, a mentor, a church member, a friend, sister, daughter, and so much more. And that has not always been the case. So just to share a little bit about my childhood and teenage years with you, when I was very young, I was molested by a family member. I don't remember a whole lot about the situation or how long it continued, but it's something that I carried with me my entire life. I never even said it out loud to myself or to anyone else until I started working a program of recovery a few years ago. I think that in some ways I was in denial or had lots of shame and so many other emotions that I was not able to process, as most people who experience that kind of thing often do. As I grew older, I heard so many stories about the domestic violence that my mother experienced at the hands of my biological father. I always thought to myself that I would never be that person. I would never allow anyone to abuse me in that way. Around the age of 15, I started using meth, cocaine, and marijuana. By the age of 17 or 18, I was using almost daily. Looking back now, I had no idea then that I was using the drugs as a means of coping with the things I had been through. I dated a few abusive men over the years. When I was about 19, I began dating the first person who ever hit me. I was head over heels in love with this kid, or so I thought. I remember the very first time he hit me, the way that it made me feel, and how I handled it. We were staying with a family member of mine, but I was the one who left. This guy was not from around there and knew only a few people, and he had nowhere to go, and I was livid, so I left. I stayed away for a night or two with a friend, and after that I remember walking into my house and then my room and seeing Daniel there. It turned out my grandmother had let him into the house, and she was unaware of the physical altercation that had transpired. I told him that he needed to leave and he was not welcome there, and as most abusers do, he began to try and manipulate the situation and say things to get me to change my mind. He said he had nowhere else to go, and knowing that to be true, I caved. Despite everything I was feeling, I let him stay. Around that time, I had an upcoming court date for a charge that I had been arrested for, stemming from ongoing substance use. I was being offered probation due to it being my first offense. Daniel suggested getting it transferred to Odessa, where his family was. He said that he would keep me away from the drugs and the people who would get me into more trouble. After all, he wanted to help. Before we left my hometown, things were already pretty bad when they would become physical. This guy was not only the first person to ever hit me, but also the first person to ever strangle me. It's hard to put into words how something like that makes you feel if it's not something you've been through yourself. I pray that no one would ever have to experience something like that. Being strangled sends you into a state of panic. When it was over, being able to breathe again was all that I could think about. Unfortunately, that wasn't an isolated experience. Fast forward to the relationship with my son's father. I began dating Jared in January of 2015. Very quickly into the dating relationship, things became volatile. I think that compared to some of the other things I had experienced, these things didn't seem as bad, and I didn't pay much attention to the red flags and warning signs. 3 months into that relationship, I found out that I was pregnant with my son. About the time I found out with the pregnancy, Jared was in jail for a parole violation. It turns out he had a rather extensive criminal history that I knew very little about. This was one of the many times he was in jail during the relationship. I couldn't give a close guess as to how many times things became violent while I was pregnant, and I didn't know. I'm so thankful that my son was okay when he was born due to all the abuse that happened before and after we became aware of the pregnancy. When Jared was out of jail, we moved from place to place until we were asked to leave because of the fighting and the arguments. We had finally run out of places to go, and Jared came up with the idea of moving to his parents in Denton. That ended up being a really dangerous decision for the most part. However, I was able to get and stay clean until a few months after having my son. One would think that being pregnant with a person's child would somehow, some way keep them from wanting to cause you harm. And that wasn't my experience, nor is it the experience of so many people who experience domestic violence at the hands of their partner. The entire relationship was saturated with violence. Jared's the type of abuser that no one would ever suspect to be that way. When he was sober, he was a very attractive, tall, blonde-haired, green-eyed man, and he could switch on the charm in a second's notice. He manipulated so many people by playing cool, calm, and collected. He could be threatening to hurt me one second, and then the next, when someone walked into the room, he would act completely calm. The ability to do that, being the type of violent person that he was, made him especially dangerous, not only to myself and our unborn child, but to his own family members even. One of the most traumatic and terrifying times in my life was when Jared strangled me while I was pregnant. I was approximately 3 to 4 months pregnant at the time. Jared had kicked in the door to the home that I was at, picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and ran down the street with me. He continued this erratic behavior, ducking behind cars as he ran. He had inadvertently caught someone's attention, and the homeowner came out, and Jared did this whole smile and wave while holding my hand act. This little act always worked for him when he would accidentally catch someone's attention with his behavior. They just went on about their business. Once that person went back into their home, we were out of sight, and Jared shoved me down beside a car in someone's driveway and whispered under his breath that I needed to shut my mouth. I was causing a scene. I was very fearful as I had no clue what he was going to do to me. I began crying and asking him why he was doing this and asking him to please let me go. He then grabbed me by the neck with one hand and placed his hand over my mouth. He told me that I needed to shut my mouth and trust him. I began to feel very lightheaded and as if I was going to pass out. I immediately stopped trying to fight him in hopes that he would let go, which he eventually did. When he loosened his grip on my neck, I saw stars. I wasn't sure whether or not I would be okay and was very fearful that my baby might be harmed. We lived with Jared's parents for a short while, but often had to leave or find somewhere to go because people got tired of all the fighting. One of the times that we left was after our son was born. We had gone to Lubbock and stayed at my great-grandmother's house. Jared had gotten upset about something and ended up leaving. Showed back up in the middle of the night and woke up everyone in the house, including my 82-year-old great-grandma. He came into the room and asked me to leave with him, and when I told him I wasn't going anywhere, he grabbed my son and tried to walk out of the house with him. My cousin stepped in his way and grabbed our son from him and told Jared that he needed to get off the property or he was going to be in serious trouble. A couple days later, Jared called me repeatedly, as he often did, and I would not accept his call. When I finally answered out of frustration, he said that he was coming to get his son and I. I always felt as if I had no choice but to leave to keep them from acting belligerent or hurting one of my family members. I later found out that after all that had transpired, my grandmother had called CPS on Jared and myself. Not long after we made it back to Denison, an investigator showed up at the house, and things got crazy. I wanted so badly to comply with the things that they were asking us to do so that they would not take our son. But Jared insisted on avoiding phone calls, not answering the door, submitting to drug screenings like they asked, and he eventually made the decision that us leaving the home would make them go away. Today, I can honestly say I'm truly thankful they did not. When we left Denison, we stayed from place to place wherever we could until Jared finally got a job, working for a company in Louisville. He met a guy there and somehow managed to get that person to offer for us to come stay with he and his wife, so that's what we did. It also happens that Jared met a man at the same company who knew a drug dealer named Dallas. It was just a matter of time before Jared had started purchasing drugs from that man, and both of us ended up strung out again. Jared started selling drugs, missing work, and things of that nature. That went on for quite some time. Although we had nothing to our names, much less a vehicle, Jared somehow managed to get a rental car and he decided he would just go get the drugs for ourselves when we ran out. Little did we know someone he had been selling to had been talking to the police, and they had been watching us for a little while. One night after we had picked up drugs, Jared fell asleep at a stoplight, and a detective that had been following us came up to the car. We were both arrested. Our son was removed and placed in foster care. I bonded out of jail and did my best to keep up with what was happening, and that was very hard to do, especially since I went back to the only thing I had ever known, the drugs. I appeared at the court dates high out of my mind. One day in the 158th District Courtroom, Judge Burgess called me out and told me that I displayed characteristics of someone who was on meth. I, of course, denied that. That day, I was given 24 hours to secure a bed at Solutions in North Texas. I was relieved and terrified all at the same time. What I came to realize later on was that day in that courtroom, I had been given a saving grace. That was the beginning of one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life. I showed up at Solutions and started on the road to recovery. I had so much to do to get better. It turns out that I needed more counseling around the trauma than I did for the years of substance abuse. I had to deal with that before I was ever going to be successful at getting and staying sober. I began to get connected with service providers for all sorts of testing. I needed tons of individual and group counseling, parenting classes, meetings, IOP, SOP, you name it, and I absolutely needed it. I remember being very angry and easily upset when I was being told all of the things that were expected of me. One day I just made a decision to put my head down and do what I was being asked. I remember completing my intake with friends of the family. I remember them telling me that CPS and the judge had ordered me to complete the advanced class. At that time, I didn't know what that was. One of the first nights I showed up, they started talking about what domestic violence was by definition and how an abuser tries to get and maintain power and control over their partner and things like that. I remember becoming very angry. Everything they were saying described a large part of the last 10 plus years of my life. Hearing that the abuse that I had experienced was absolutely not my fault sounded like a joke to me. Of course it was my fault, or so that's what I thought. I thought that the facilitators were talking like crazy people. One of the first times I really opened up was when Donna Bloom came to talk about legal processes and how they have a department that could help us with things like that. She was talking about things like protective orders, child custody, and a whole lot of stuff I knew nothing about. I told her and the group some of the ways that Jared had been harassing me, trying to control things within our CPS case and things of that nature. Donna asked questions and tried to help me get some clarity around what options I had and who could help me with those things. That was one of the first times I recall thinking to myself, okay, I cannot live like this anymore. Something has to give. I had no idea how it was going to happen, and I was absolutely terrified, but it was the starting point. Another class that I specifically recall was a class on the effects of domestic violence on children. I remember sitting in class watching the video they showed. I always just assumed that because my son was just a baby or in the other room sleeping when most of our fights would occur, that it wouldn't affect him as much as it would if he saw it happen or if he had experienced the physical abuse himself. I learned that day that was not the case. Children whose brains are still developing are actually more likely to be impacted in a very negative way. I felt all sorts of emotions and thought to myself, I'm not going to let this keep happening around my son. I have to get out of this relationship. That was a very pivotal moment for mine and my son's life. That was the moment everything finally started to click for me. Had I never been referred to friends of the family and been introduced to those amazing people who truly love helping people heal from such dark pasts, who knows where I would be today. Thinking back, I recall conversations with the CPS worker and them just not understanding what I meant when I told them that I didn't want to be in that relationship any longer, but my partner wasn't going to let that happen. Everyone looked at me like I wasn't making any sense when I would say things like that. I was told, okay, well, we'll just let them know. I don't think that they truly understood how complex the abuse was in my situation, and my partner wasn't going to just go away. So with the help of Solutions of North Texas, Denton County Friends of the Family, Child Protective Services, Family Drug Court, and all the other people who were such a huge part of my life for so long, I've been able to overcome so much. I never imagined the life that I have today. I was given an amazing opportunity to work on staff with Friends of the Family as a survivor mentor for almost 2.5 years, and I was privileged to work with clients going through similar situations as I went through and share my experiences with them. There's something really encouraging about having someone who's experienced what you're dealing with. I got a weekly refresher on all the things I learned that literally helped change my life and get me to where I am today. If I could have you take one thing from my story, it would be that despite how hopeless and alone you may feel at the hands of an abuser, that there is always hope. There's teams of people who can teach you what your options are and get you connected with the resources you need to bring that change about. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, for having the courage to share your story with us. Um, and I just have a few questions for you. Looking back, what are some of the red flags you noticed in your relationship with Daniel as well as with Jared?
I was thinking about this before we came on. I think that I didn't learn what the term gaslighting meant until I was connected with friends of the family, but there was a lot of that, and especially because we were in active addiction, you're kind of second guessing, like, am I crazy? Like, did I imagine this? But to somebody who's going to use power and control or wants power and control over you, and is also very manipulative because of an addiction. So there was lots of gaslighting going on, and that's minimizing, denying, blaming, basically.
And that gaslighting, basically making you doubt yourself and
Yeah.
what you felt was reality.
Yes. So there was lots of that, lots of just very controlling behaviors. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned in your story that CPS said, well, why don't you just leave? We'll just tell them you'll leave. But we know that it's actually really difficult in an abusive relationship to leave, and is actually the most dangerous time for people who choose to leave because that abuser is losing their power and control. What was it like for you leaving both of these abusive relationships that you've experienced?
Leaving the first one was definitely easier. I think because I had like this want to be loved and not knowing like what that looked like, and not knowing that these things weren't acceptable and that wasn't love. I would stay, or I would think that we could work it out. So leaving the first relationship was definitely easier. If there can be an easy leaving a domestic violence, a relationship where there's domestic violence. But when it came time to leave Jared, like I was really afraid. Like I said in my story, it was like this: come close, now get away, come close, get away, type of behavior. He would cause fights so he could leave, or I would leave, and then he would come find me because it's all about controlling me and bringing me back. And so I would leave gladly and be thankful to leave. And then I would have to come back because he would get belligerent, and I knew he wouldn't hurt me as bad as I was afraid he might hurt, my family members. And so it's just a play on fear, on threats, not only to you, but the people that you love. And yeah, if they didn't have to deal with it, and I would, just making the best decision that I thought I could make at the time, in that moment.
And so for you in your relationship with Jared, a lot of the reason that you stayed, it sounds like, was because you felt like you were keeping the people that you care about safe by staying with them.
Yeah. And I didn't really have the resources to leave. And of course, the isolation component, in Lubbock, I was around family and friends. And even though they were frustrated, if I needed something, they would more than likely be there. But 5 hours away, they couldn't get to me, and I didn't know anybody. So it was another one up that he had on me.
It made it harder to get any kind of help to leave.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned a number of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, that you experienced. How do you feel that those impacted your experiences growing up?
Yeah, so I think, I definitely think that they kind of marginalized me even more so. I know people who are adult children of addict alcoholic parents who don't have problems with addiction. But I did have an addict alcoholic biological father. And even though he wasn't in my life, I had that, I had that struggle. And you compound that with, molestation at an early age. And like I said, I never vocalized that. I never said that out loud. I just carried that around. And so I think that I absolutely played a part in the relationships that I chose. And when I said that I wasn't going to be like my mom, I meant it. But that's exactly what happened. And I think that those things, I had the trauma from those things, and it was a means of coping. And so, yeah, I think that they definitely impacted those relationship choices and the way my life was for so long.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience that says, can you talk about victim blaming and things that should not be said to victims? So in your experience, do you feel that there were some things that maybe you were told along the way that just were not helpful, maybe even hurtful, or times where you felt like someone just really, you mentioned the CPS caseworkers already with, making it sound so easy to leave the relationship, but do you feel like there were any other times where there were times that you were told things that just were not helpful?
Yeah. I think that, depending on, if there's children involved, it always gets really, it can get even more so complicated. For me, for example, my mom, she just, the way that she was raised, she thought, like, well, that's your son's dad. He needs his dad. And so I had this in the back of my head, and I'm like, oh, like, we're a family, this needs to work. And that was so dangerous, because my son doesn't need a person in his life who's going to make parenting choices to use domestic violence against his mother. And that's absolutely a parenting choice. And I would do it by myself 100 times over before I have somebody that's going to be that. I don't want that to be what my son thinks is normal. And so if you have, a family, just a family, like culturally, there's different, beliefs and things. Like, I think that it's kind of looked down upon, to be a single mom. But I would rather be a single mom and hear from my son than him grow up in a home where, there's domestic violence being used or shouting. And I would rather do it alone 100 times over than that be the situation. And then, so just not staying in a bad situation, because, your child needs a mother or a father. And then, asking, why don't they leave? Or it must not be that bad. Because it oftentimes is, like we said, more dangerous when you're getting ready to leave. And if they're aware of it, they're going to become more erratic. And not only are they more dangerous to you and or your children if they're involved, but to the people around you. I had coworkers that were threatened. I lost jobs because of his erratic behavior, his own family. So it's almost, you're already on high alert anyways when you're in that situation. And I remember going to work and having my boss take me to like a shelter in Grayson County to like try with my, she sat in the car with my son while I go in there and try and get like information and then go home and act like I was it's just, you have to always be thinking ahead, and you're already pretty hyper vigilant. So it's not always that they're not, that they're staying because it's not that bad. Maybe they're trying to figure out the safest way to leave.
Which safety planning is a really important piece if someone is choosing to leave an abusive relationship, and making sure that leaving that relationship is done in a safe way. And did you have any help working out any kind of safety plan as you prepared to leave?
Not in Grayson County. I didn't. I got I didn't in Grayson County. I didn't follow through with it. They started asking a bunch of questions, and then I was like really blown away. When I came to Denton County Friends and Family, there was things because we had the CPS involvement. There were court orders in place, and but for somebody like Jared who has little regard for the law or other people, those things didn't really matter. He still kind of tried to buck the system, if you will. But I did have, because of the CPS intervention, I had, an attorney to help, and I had the connection at Friends of the Family. So yeah, they're really good at safety planning and getting you connected with those contacts that can help if it's a scope that they're not able or super familiar with.
Thank you. And another question from the audience we have is, what advice would you give someone who is in an abusive relationship?
Know that it's a choice. If somebody is using controlling behaviors on you or towards you, that's a choice that they're making. And I think one of the things that I used to think, oh, well, he's jealous. Like, he cares a lot about me. And it was kind of like this infatuation. Like, I felt like it was infatuation, and it was a red flag for me. So get connected in a safe way, get help. At Friends of the Family, you can text if that's a safe option for you. But have a safe person who knows what you're going through, and just kind of can be aware of what's going on, so you can help you navigate through that decision to leave.
Thank you. And Amber has mentioned Denton County Friends of the Family. In Denton County, that is the local domestic violence resource for us. We'll also be having some other domestic violence resources in the NCTC service area up here, as well as the national hotline. So anyone in our service area or anyone viewing will have access to crisis line information. Here they are. If anyone is in need to safety plan or find shelter, or in crisis due to an abusive relationship, or any of those things, any of these organizations can help with making sure that you stay safe and that you have help. So, Amber, is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation this evening?
Just that, that there is hope. My life looks very different than what I ever imagined it could look like. And when you're in it and going through it, it can feel very hopeless. And there is hope. There is hope. There's a way out. It's hard, but it's possible. Just make those calls, get connected, reach out in a safe way. And yeah, thank you.
All right. We want to thank you so much for having the courage to come here this evening with us and share your story, with the hope of, helping someone else out there who might be experiencing relationship violence, so that they realize that there are resources, there's help, there's, hope for things to get better. So thank you so much for being here and for being so brave. And I also want to thank Daisy Garcia, who's been our technical support in the background this evening. And also want to mention that NCTC is doing a donation drive this month to collect items for the local shelters. So if you have any donation items you would like to drop off, you can do that at any of our campuses, and that is organized by our Students in Action group. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and hope you all take care.